Professor González's research and publications focus on the study of intergroup contact, intergroup relationships and emotions, prejudice, acculturation processes involving Peruvian immigrants in Chile, helping behaviors, social movements, as well as attitudes and behaviors of reparation associated with political and ethnic conflicts. He collaborates with an extensive international network of researchers in England, Germany, the United States, Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Israel, Australia, New Zealand, truly a comparative scholar, and sets a wonderful example for all of us thinking about our work in international political psychology. He's the co-founder of the MIDE UC Measurement Center, where he currently serves as alternate director. And currently he's the principal investigator of the Center for Studies on Conflict and Social Cohesion and associate researcher of the Center for Intercultural and Indigenous Studies. He's published over 75 peer-reviewed papers and book chapters. His work has been cited thousands of times by people all over the world, scholars all over the world, and he's received numerous awards. He and his students have had a large and, in fact, very quickly growing impact on ISPP. This is not the only organization that can say that about his group, but in terms of their work on leadership and in the governing council and in many other ways, we are all so grateful to Roberto and his students. It's one of the president's great privileges to select one or more keynote speakers each year. And last year I thought hard about who would be great to have in this slot and who we would all like to hear from. Roberto's work immediately came to my mind. His work on protest movements and collective action seemed very timely as we were actively deliberating when we as an organization might be able to visit South America and maybe Santiago in particular, given all of the protest actions that were taking place at the time. Now, of course, my decision seems even more prescient, if I may say so myself, because so many other nations, including and perhaps especially my own in the United States, are engaged in collective action on a very large scale. So please welcome Professor González to speak to us about collective action as a vehicle for social change, the psychological and political antecedents and consequences of the social outbreak. Professor.
Thank you very much, Nick. I really appreciate your introduction. I feel really grateful for being invited to contribute to this first virtual meeting, ISPP. So first of all, I would like to say that most of the work that I'm going to present today is based on a large collaboration that we settle with different people around the world, as you mentioned, Nick, but also with people in my lab and other colleagues working very committed to provide evidence from this region. This particular region in Latin America, which has been, as you know, less represented at the international level. So that's why for us it's been so important to put attention on issues like collective action and to try to address particularly why Chile became an important country in which we can learn from particular experience. And I'd like to start reminding the audience that this is one of the important triggers that opened the discussion heavily in Chile when a lot of countries in the region were experiencing different outbreaks, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia particularly, of course, Venezuela. And that was an incredible, strong phrase that the president claimed, our president in Chile, that we were living in an oasis in the region. 1 week later, just 1 week later, we start seeing on Monday, the 14th of October, a big important movement that started with a very tiny, allegedly insignificant effect, driven by increasing the fare of the metro station for students. As you can see here, it's a very, very small amount of money from anyone who perceives increasing fares of transport with such a tiny money wouldn't have any impact at all. But it immediately start triggering protests from the students, secondary students. And as you can see, they start jumping and avoiding paying the metro. Then on Thursday, the day after this long collective action, police start acting with the riots police to take control of this protest. As you can see, immediately trigger an intergroup dynamic in which this group of students protesting about this increasing in prices were facing police riots to deal with this process. On Friday, immediately people reacting, and as you can see, start collectively joining these actions of the students against the government for increasing the prices. That was on Friday. And immediately that day, during the day, a lot of metro stations were attacked, put in fire, more than 75 out of 150, which is a large proportion of them. Then big issues start all over the country, not just in Santiago, spread in different cities, until on Saturday, the 19th, just in a week time, the state of emergency and the curfew start taking over in the country. Imagine what it means for a country that experienced a dictatorship, seeing military again on the street. And as you can see, a lot of destruction, a lot of reaction, public and radicalization of the movement being part of the picture all over the country. And that created an aggressive, massive conflict situation that really impact people's life in many, many respects. So the question for us was, how can we understand why this social outbreak took place in Santiago, in Chile, broadly speaking, in a country that was experiencing significant changes all over the years? In the next section, I would like to reflect on that process to give you a flavor, not just focusing the attention on psychological process that were taking place during this collective action, but also considering the context of Chile during the time before and after that outbreak. Chile experiencing a significant development, there's no doubt about it. During the last 28 years, it's been significant changes, which obviously changed the expectation about what is being Chilean and what is the future for the Chileans in terms of this development. Let me give you some brief description of these increasing changes. If we look at the income growth, you can see very, very large change, significant, important changes from the 90s and the 80s till the 2018. Now, look at the percentage of poverty going down significantly. Back in the 1990, when we recovered democracy, about 40% is extreme high. 40% of the population were poor. If you see that now the trend, we reach less than 20% altogether, and those numbers speak about this increasing potential changes in the Chileans' poverty levels. But on the other hand, Chile has impacted secondary and tertiary education system. We manage now with different policies to retain students in the school system. Huge amount of people now finish school. That wasn't the case back in the 90s. But that also impacts the number of students enrolled in higher education. Look at this figure. This is a huge increase. People become more educated, accessing to one of the major factors that explains social mobility, increasing the level of education. Alongside this education, the students' funding and the loan system also increased consistently with the increasing number of enrollment. However, as we know, that was one of the major issues because the number of students was so big, the funding was not enough to cover the expenses, and families were supporting a lot of these resources. On the other hand, even though we have this positive kind of trend in the development of Chile, we still, as a country, we are considered as one of the unequal countries in the world and in the most unequal region in Latin America. If you see the income share presented by quintiles, you can see that there is a lot of disparity yet in all the different levels of income. That's the big gap we have still within these groups. However, this trend is being changing as the Gini index shows, and I was told by an economist last week that this reduction is pretty high. But though, in the concert of more developing countries, we are still in the group of people experiencing quite high disparities in income level. We are still growing in many aspects, but also experiencing these inequality issues. Then, this is another important issue that is being portrayed in the media, this is the level of household debt. If you can see how much is being growing, the percentage of people debt in terms of their income. Again, those were, we believe, and by inspecting the media, part of the main issues behind this collective action and protest. By the way, you can imagine whether 30 pesos could impact their people's pockets with this amount of debt in the families. And that's why we call this the dark side of the moon. We've been experiencing as a country number of issues in which collusions, different form of negative use of public money from the army, in new competition from companies selling goods, pharmacies, a number of cases of sexual abuse committed by priests in the Catholic Church. Again, pharmacies colluded to control prices and so forth, increases the very negative view of institutions who were surrounding people in this country. Even that affect police. All of these institutions were scandals, corruptions all over the system that were claimed to be also explaining part of this impressive figure. As you can see, the government, Congress, the justice, politicians, trust in them is so low that almost about to be out of the figures. But if you look at these figures, all of them, the police, armies, police, the evangelic church, the Catholic Church, all these institutions that have been heavily impacting the tradition of Chile has been lost trust on the public opinion. Therefore, we can see there are a number of demands that have been increasing over the years. As an example, back in 2006, the students' movement, this time a massive collective action started from school students protesting about the quality of education. Then in 2011, university students started doing exactly the same. Those protests were really installing the collective action way of dealing with social change. When we reached the October 2019, we got one of the biggest ever collective action with 1.2 million people on the street. That was an amazing experience, but also reflecting how people was really unified to deal with these social issues that were not addressed by any other government during the 25 years since we recovered democracy. So a number of other issues were adding flavor into this conflict when, for instance, the president declared we are at war. Imagine that signal, that message in the middle of this protest. He meant to be war against violence in his view, but he was immediately creating an intergroup dynamic by fostering this kind of statement. So let me now try to connect radicalization to analyze this conflict. Clearly, we think the way police deal with this collective action, as many researchers have been discussing in the literature, has been dealing with the way different groups are interacting during protests. And as you can see, this is an example that shows clearly what is called in Chile the first line. And as you can see, those are meant to be warriors. They were fighting and defending the group of protesters. They were creating an identity. They feel proud of being in playing this role, and they feel identified with this group. People respect them, and they were every given protest there fighting against police. This is clearly an intergroup dynamic that will start driving this process of radicalization. As we know in the literature, the way police and authorities deal with collective action is very, very important for people to understand how much they might provide support, or people will be willing to carry on more radical actions. The literature is really developed in this respect, and we know when the disproportionate and discriminate use of force could trigger the perception that police is an actor that people is willing to act against and fight. On the other hand, radical actions portrayed by radical groups could be now accepted by people who are changing the group norms in terms of the response to the conflict. So we didn't know exactly why, but certainly radicalization and the legitimization of radical actions were supporting when police was confronting this group in such a negative and strong way in this protest. Obviously, non-participants, people who were witnessing this collective action, start supporting action of the radical group against police as a way of simply identifying with this group and supporting the group as some legitimate way of confronting these social issues. On the other hand, the proliferation of images of videos that portray indiscriminate use of force, we think also may have increased radicalization of the protesters. So the dynamic that was created by this way of facing could be really strongly related to the escalation of violence. Involvement of protests and police created an intergroup dynamic that fostered this specific radicalization process. Now, I'm going to present now some evidence based on studies that we've been conducted in Chile, that we were lucky to have the opportunity to measure people in a longitudinal studies from a group of students, in this case, college students. If you look at, we have 5 waves of a large group of students. We were following them, and it happened to be the case that we managed to contact them again right after October 19 of the outbreak in Chile. So this 6th wave are the very same individuals who were interviewed every time, even before and after the outbreak. That created opportunities for us to see whether this outbreak, this kind of experimental, natural experiment, could influence the way the students were performing in collective action. Just to give you a flavor of the items we were following, this is a large study. We are focusing now on what we call conventional actions, like participating in discussion meetings, spread information in the social network, painting canvas and attending marches, versus more radical actions that confronting the police in protests, participating in barricades and blocking streets and so forth. So we're going to look at these 2 major distinctions, conventional and radical action, and see how much those behavior change as a function of this outbreak. So here, I'm going to present growth modeling effect, but for simplicity, I'm going to just focus on the observed means. But those analyses have been conducted in order to test the slope of these changes, if there were any, using different equations like linear, secondary levels, and third, in order to test whether this effect were shifting from one measure to another. So here we're going to present the conventional radical, and the yellow line represent the time point where we had the outbreak. So as you can see, first, this is a conventional line. The blue one represent the level of the observed means out of this equation on the growth modeling. And you can see this is a quadratic model. And you can see all these activities were quite stable over the months. This is 2 years period. But then immediately shift and increase change, significant change after the outbreak. That was the same what happened with the radicalization measure. The radicalization, this gap has always been the case in all of these studies. Radical actions are less common than conventional action. Remember, those are university college students who were mostly protecting against issues regarding education, but other social issues too. So you can see this strong impact that this outbreak increased this change in behavior over time. Now, we asked this data whether this group could follow different paths. All people in the conventional action or the radical action follow the same trend. So we conduct what we call latent class analysis in order to identify this pattern. And if you can see, all of them had different changes. You had 3 groups. That's the group we represent. 13 of them were consistently highly activist in collective actions. We have those groups who were very low level active, and this in the middle. If you can see again, all of them shift into an increased number of conventional participation. You can see different level of them. Then we look at for different correlates. If these three different groups were connected with other factors from the literature of collective action. Just an example, we select some of these measures. For instance, the level of anger. Whether anger was connected or not with these different trends, as you can see, there are three very different levels regarding the activist versus the less activist guys. As you can see, all over the time, significantly higher level of anger in the more activists compared to the low. However, after the outbreak, all of these tend to be more closely together in level of anger. Again, was achieved in the level of anger over the time measured. When we look at the concept what we call nothing to lose. This is an idea that we've been discussing in our group and with Russell Speer in the Netherlands, in Groningen, in which we captured the sense of people said, there's nothing to lose. We need to do things, even we have things to address because we need to promote a change. So when there's nothing to lose, people, we think, will be more willing to engage in action to change things. And as you see, in nothing to lose idea, all of the groups increased, and this trend was very important because all the groups were increasing in the sense of nothing to lose. We need to change things no matter what. Thirdly, we look at for the interaction with friends. How much friends were perceiving or supporting me going into this collective action? And again, we can see the norms provided by friends group were important for triggering participation in these conventional actions. And that was also important after the outbreak in 2019. Having contact with members who are also attending the protest. This is a very kind of descriptive norm. To what extent seeing others actively involved in conventional action triggers differences in this pattern. And again, you can see there are some changes, but again, contact, norms, interaction with people who are attending marches are also playing an important role. Question is now whether that happened the same with the radicalization. Again, we estimate the observed means of this group, and you can see radicalization. We have three different groups. The majority of them, 85% of them, are not involved in radical actions. But again, you can see this 14% of people were performing in rather different ways. So this is a group, 4% very actively radical, who were performing radical actions. But again, these three groups quietly differentiate from each other. What were the correlate with them? If we look at the level of anger, again, you can see now all of them become a single unity. Anger was significantly similar for all of them after the outbreak, even those who were low in activism in previous measure. Nothing to lose idea, again, you can see all this positive trend increases over the outbreak, again, for all groups. So this group of radical students become even more radical after the outbreak of the movement. Again, the same pattern we face by friendships and by contact with other group members. So radicalization, as well as the conventional actions, were somehow connected to changes in pattern of this contact interaction, anger, and feeling of nothing to lose. Now, we were also lucky. I said lucky because hardly ever we got opportunities to capture a process that are happening when such a big event take place like this outbreak. In this study, this is an independent study from the other one. We actually take 100 participants from the previous study that finished in May in 2019, and we invite them to participate in other week longitudinal study to focus on a radicalization group. They were all active members involved in the student movement. So we had here 10 different waves, 10 measure points. And it happened to be the case that we have all these measures are after the outbreak. So this is a quite unique opportunity to see how they perform before and after with several measure points now after the outbreak. And again, we did analysis using growth modeling again, to try to see whether there was a linear, quadratical, and so forth trend. And this is the figure what we got in this group. First, I'm portraying the conventional, and you can see in this very active, remember those guys were actively involved in collective actions. And this is a extreme change in the slope. And this is the significance of the intercept. And that's the significance of the slope. So they were gradually going down until the outbreak shifted the whole behavior. And this is the intercept and the slope again. But you can see strong effect, how this massive shock increases collective action on those actively involved participants. And this is the radical group. This is the people who were performing radical actions. And again, you can see follow more or less the very same trend. As we did in the previous studies, we wanted to see whether these two different groups' behavior could change in different ways. So by looking at latent class analysis, we identified 3 different groups. This is the conventional that were mostly very kind of active, but look at this group. When they have medium activism, they really change in their pattern and the radicalization as well. So not all of the people involved in conventional action perform in the same way. So there was a subgroup here that almost closely related to the more active group in the past. That is a big shift into mobilizing people after the outbreak. For the radical group, we have pretty much the same trend. However, the slope here is more deep and going down after the outbreak, but still you can see these 2 groups really follow different trajectories as compared to this one, who were mostly low in radical action, but still this very low become more radical. Even those people who were almost not engaging in radical actions. Now, one of the aspects and one of the hypotheses we have in our research group that this behavior is somehow connected to group norms. When I was mentioning about how the dynamic of these riots, police fighting with this protester in the main first line were driven partly because in-group norms were changing and people were signaling the way we need to behave in order to face police, for instance, in a collective action. So we've been researching a lot, several years, on the role of norm in guiding behavior. And as you may know, social norms have been extremely attached to psychology and sociology and many other disciplines because they are strongly influencing behavior and people's conformity. It's a very well-known phenomenon. Individuals, we have different social networks that could influence our behavior in different ways. So we act in way consistent what we perceive others' relevance do. That's a very important aspect to imagine is playing a role when we're talking about collective action. Because we infer social norm by actual behavior or the behavior that other members play, they may be central for guiding our own behavior. This is an interesting way of imagining that group norm could be actually influences collective action participation. So we focus the attention in 2 traditional sources norm, what people should do as known as the injunctive norm, to what extent my friends want me to do this, as an example, or what people actually do. If I perceive my friends doing or attending marches, how much that influences my own behavior. If I see my parents attending marches, does it really affect my own decision of going to protest, for instance? So we focus on that particular norms, injunctive and descriptive, because we know these 2 kind of norms could be really impacting behavior, particularly when they are aligned. On the other hand, these 2 forms of norm provide highly successful approach to social influence. There's a large group of people in different university institutions, not just the work of Cialdini, Betsy Pallock in Stanford is been working heavily on the influence of norm affecting group behavior and changing collective actions. So One of the sources of norm for us is the influence of family. We know that family are important group that influence children's political development and children's political standpoint. There's a lot of body of research in the socialization of political psychology that show clearly this effect. We know some group norms and particularly could be relevant for guiding collective actions. However, the role of norm regarding family is less considered in the literature, in general terms. So, in the present research I'm going to address now onward, we're focusing the attention how much the group norms coming from families could also be influential in my own participation, my own level of collective action. So I'm going to present two studies that we already conducted based on the context of the intergenerational transmission of collective action. Partly we assume parents are playing a role when transmitting their motivations, their behavior, signaling their kids' behavior in the present. So here's the result of one of the studies that currently, I must say now, is accepted, not under review. Just recently, a couple of days ago, we were told. And this is, we're predicting in children's participation in radical action or conventional actions. And that behavior is connected to what parents did, their parents did in the past, and what the parent did in the present. So what we see here is what parents did in the past. If they perceive their friends foster them, they are more actively involved in the present. So having been actively involved in the past triggers participation of parents in the present. Parents' presentation, parent collective action or participation in politics also influence significantly, that's the arrow telling us, parents' expectation about the kids. So active parents in the past predicted parents' actively participation in the present, and that influenced what they expect about the children. So the question is whether what parents does in the present or in the past does any effect on what their children do in the present, either radical and conventional action. And what we found was children, the more they perceive their family members, their parents, want them to be engaged in collective actions, the more they increase their level of participation in collective action, particularly when they see their parents participate in the present. Also, expectation about parents predicted significantly perception of injecting norm from their kids' perspective. For radical action instead was a direct link. So it means just seeing parents participating was enough for them to trigger participation in radical actions. Somehow, norms like this, the injective norm, are less connected to radicalization as with conventional norms. Then we expand this idea over and we look at again using a longitudinal analysis, and we came back to the same previous study we mentioned before. And here we have 3 waves in which we asked university college students, the very same that I mentioned before, in wave 1, whether they perceive their parent participating, whether that influences their perceived injecting norms, whether they think their parents want them to participate, and whether they actually participate in collective action, in conventional actions. So to what extent perceiving my parents made me think they want me to participate, and then I end up participating more. That's exactly what we test in this analysis. This is a cross-lag longitudinal analysis, and when you see there against the straight arrow, it means significant effect. So seeing parents participating predicted change over time, so increases participation in conventional actions. But also, when I see parents participating, increases perception of that parents were actually fostering them participating, and the more they perceive they wanted to participate. So this is a mediation effect in which injecting norm is mediating the impact of perceived parents' norm on collective action. That was more or less what happened in the norm on one direction. But also, we see that effect, the opposite effect, from injected to family norms. When we look at the radical action, was pretty much the same effect, except that we didn't find this direct path, but also mediated here. Then we replicate the same instance using a national representative study in this longitudinal national representative sample in Chile. And again, we test whether family norms and friends are actually increasing participation in collective action. And now testing another potential mediator, which is efficacy. To what extent seeing my parents and friends participating, attending marches, increase my sense of efficacy, which in turn predict my participation. Here we got 3 years time differences. And again, you will see norms are heavily influencing the perception of efficacy, which in turn predict sense of a level of participation over the year. Family again participating and influencing norms. And that happened with participation in collective action. So as you see, collective action and social change are now an enduring phenomenon around the world. We know that development and unfulfilled expectation could be considered as an important aspect to put in the image when trying to understand this heavy change process. Social inequality is behind the scenes, playing a significant role. Even countries are increasingly changes as Chile. We cannot forget that inequality could be a strong driver for providing changes over the population. Distrust in the governments, political parties, parliament, justice, political church, all these institutions are also important to consider. The loss of the legitimacy of these institutions that are ruling out the country in different respects are also an important aspect to address if we need to think about social change. The fears of vulnerability and uncertainty, unemployment, income, salary, debts, all these issues that we mostly in psychology we're not considering most of the time. We're really focused on a specific mechanism. I think it's so important to consider when the social context influencing behavior. The role of anger, contempt, all of these powerful emotions are also important to look at carefully, because anytime we see this institution badly performing, colluded, or using resources in an unexpected way, could also be significantly triggering this collective action and radicalization. As I mentioned before, the way police is facing this issue is a major issue to address. Collective action all over the world now. If institutions like police and the government in charge of police are not dealing with this issue, we will see radicalization process taking over most of the time. The way we face collective action induce an intergroup dynamic in which we need to carefully understand and allow people to protest in ways that are not affecting life in so many different ways that could trigger complex dynamics and radicalization processes. The role of anger and the nothing to lose idea were really important to consider when addressing this issue too. The social break in fueling radical conventional action, as you see in the several studies I show you, this massive shock could trigger very important change in collective actions. So we cannot disregard and assume they are just simply an event that is going away. They may actively produce changes in behavior of group over the months. We're not collecting data in 6 months time, so we hopefully see whether this collective action will carry on or not over the next time on time. We also want to put the attention on the role of norm in guiding radical and conventional behavior. By studying norms, we understand why this process takes place. We need to focus more research on the influence of norms. Norms are so critical to understand because they're really playing a role as is being depicted in so many research in different issues. Now we have evidence that norms are relevant when addressing intergeneralization, transmission, collective action, the role of family and friends, and so forth, contact with other protesters, and so forth. The question is whether this norm operates in the same way across different social movements. These are very important questions because we are facing different movements across the globe, and we need to focus more on a specific kind of movement. Movements dealing with social change, climate change. We know the feminist group movement all over the world, to mention some of this example. Collective actions are now beyond the borders, as we know it's a global phenomenon, and it's going to stay in this social context for many years. So we need to really put attention on this. As an example, I would like to finish with that idea of adopting and supporting social causes of other protests in the world. I believe part of this is the influence of norm. Have a look at this. You remember the Las Tesis? This is a rapist in your path. It's a movement that started in Chile. It's a small group of female that create that performance. Probably many of you saw it. And you can see in different countries, Istanbul, Paris, France, London, Mexico, were replicating the very same performance. Tell me, this is a real example of the influence of social norms. The behavior of a small group in Chile was able to trigger collective action all over the world, but not just there. Look at this figure. This is the 8th of March, International Women's Day. I just put this picture here to show you how many groups and movements were spread all over the world, showing how important the influence of collective action from one country to another is actually influences people's behavior. Hong Kong, Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd's protests because of this huge event are very clear signals that these movements are now a source of influence of everyone's behavior. This is a great opportunity to focus the attention on them. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for attending this talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Gonzalez. It was a very interesting talk, and I remember in January when I saw you last and saw this work, you were so excited about the next wave of data to come in, and I was looking forward to it too. And now I can see that many of your expectations were borne out, and very interesting work. Before we begin the question and answer, I would love to ask the audience if you would please use room 1 if you can. Log into room 1 in order to ask questions. That way all the questions will appear in just one room and I won't have to scroll around. I will still scroll around in case other people put questions in other rooms, but the questions that come up in room 1 are going to be a privilege because I'll see them right away. And let me say before we get started also, I encourage everyone in the audience, and in fact, I hope everyone in the membership will join us after this talk in the ISPP business meeting. Sometimes folks don't know this is open to all of you. It's your meeting where the leadership will talk to you about things that are going on behind the scenes, a look under the hood, so to speak, and you can see how the running of the organization is going. And I'm hoping there will be time in that meeting as well for questions of all of us that are going to be making a presentation. But before we do that, of course, let's have questions for this really amazing comprehensive work on collective action in a moment where it seems it's really important. It's always important to discuss this, but it's really important right now for all of us to think about this. So thank you very much, Roberto. Let me ask the first question that's come in. The questioner says, thanks for your incredibly meaningful presentation and impressive empirical evidence. My question is, in our own studies, we observed that one of the main threats experienced by Chileans during COVID-19 is the political instrumentalization of the lockdown. How do you think that the current global pandemic will impact protest in Chile?
Do you want me to address them all one by one?
Let's do one by one as they come in, because I think I'll probably be looking around for others.
Well, obviously, the pandemic fostered people to stay. Give you a context. In Chile, we've been facing 10.8 million people is locked down currently, and the major cities are now locked down. So, as you would imagine, our measure over the next months, following the same groups, will be heavily reduced because of the lockdown. So the pandemic fostered people to stay at home, and obviously limiting possibilities of doing collective action. Even though I must say there are several ways of collective action that have been taking place now. As an example, when the medicals and doctors and professionals working in the health system start to be discriminated against because they were kind of source of influencing or affecting people contamination, a lot of people start reacting in every night at 8 p.m. or 9 p.m., giving them an applause. Those forms of collective action were heavily spread in the country as a way of reacting to this negative behavior. But also there are other ways of protesting using social media. So I think social media has been another vehicle in which behavior could be expressing reactions and negative, not negative behavior, but thinking ideas about the way the country has been handling, particularly the government handling the pandemic reaction. Obviously, the way countries deal with pandemic could also trigger reactions in future collective actions. In Chile, we've been facing a number of initiatives coming from the government and giving resources to tackle different processes. And it's been criticized heavily by different institutions because the implementation of this policy hasn't been effective in terms of timing. So it's been 4 months since we start facing this pandemic effect and the lockdown, and the resources have been, and the measures have been implemented in different timing, affecting heavily different populations. So obviously that could trigger negative reactions in the population, as it is the case. Just to give you an example, popularity as a president is going down recently in new polls showing that effect. And people have very negative expectation about the future in terms of economic stability, loss of jobs. So again, the pandemic, no doubt about it, will influence collective actions in the future. The critical issue is how are we going to introduce measures to allow people to overcome this limitation, these problems, the actual problem that people is facing. So that will depend how the political system and the government system is joining forces. Today, fortunately, they are making effort to connect the parliaments, the new laws that allows to implement this measure. But it's important the timing because that is really impacting people's life in significant ways. So I think radicalization or conventional action will be present anyway in the next month. Unfortunately, some people may think this is negative, but I think it's partly a consequence of this changing process that has been taking place for the next maybe year or so.
Thank you, Roberto, for that. I'll just read to you a couple of nice comments because I think if we were all together, you would like to hear some of these things from the audience. So first, I wish I could give you a round of applause. Excellent work. That's just not a question, but a nice comment. Another question is from Anka Manescu. She says, wonderful talk, Roberto. Such amazing longitudinal designs and theoretical insights into the normative influences on collective action and different types of collective action. Quick comment, are norms about inaction similarly going to be transmitted across generations and across countries? Action and inaction do not have to be complete opposites, or do they?
Thank you, Anka. Very interesting question. We haven't researched on inaction norms here. There's work done in intergroup contact in which they've been researching in norms that prevent contact with the out group. So as well as we have norms that fostering contact with out group members, to what extent you perceive my fellow friends want me to have contact. It could be my fellow friends don't want me to or disregard me to have contact with them. I'm not aware of any work in that particular way, but what we have as an evidence when we have this witnessing people who are more passive in a way, by simply seeing others, they are increasing their support to collective actions, even though they are not actively involved, which is very important. 2 examples. Back in 2011, 82% of the population, 82, were supporting the collective action of the student movement, 82. But only 11% of them were taking actual action on the street. So those witnessing, those passive, active supporters are very important because they could be not actively involved, but they could be very heavily politically influential in changing, for instance, voting behavior. So don't think those people who are not active are not influential. They could be very influential. So many people have concern about going to a street because, especially when they become more radicalized actions, people are afraid of being attacked by police or facing conflict, but doesn't mean they are not supporting movement. Even in Chile, during the outbreak, 57% after a month of massive outbreak and very heavy radicalization were supporting these radical actions. And people were saying, why people is supporting burning the metro? Some people claim, and there were a lot of evidence in the interviews and media, people claim that was the only way to change things. So by not simply motivating participation, it doesn't mean people is supporting actions. So we need to carefully consider this. So inaction doesn't mean necessarily not being actively in other kind of behavior. Voting, for instance, we are now addressing in October, hopefully, changing the constitutions. We're voting a referendum to say, yes, we want to change the constitution or not. I guess partly this collective action are heavily influencing this. Even people who are not attending these marches are more willing to change the constitution now as a consequence of this action. So, a very important issue, Antka, to study these inaction norms in the future research programs.
Thank you, Roberto. Yes, this is also the distinction you're making between conventional and radical action is so relevant for us as well here in the U.S. And so I think we'll learn a lot from this work. And we have a number of other members who are doing work on this as well. Let's see. Next, we have the question. Thank you very much for the interesting talk. My question is, as students were the ones starting riots in Chile as well as elsewhere, can you share more on what you think can be the role that academia and science play in shaping the norms you talked about?
Well, many students' movement have been significantly playing a role, at least in our political history, and probably in many other countries' history too. When we were young and during the dictatorship, it was the university students who were leading this protest too, where mostly this group facing police, facing protests. Remember, the environment was really dangerous at that time because a dictatorship was inflicting sanctions and punishment and even the terrible human rights issues that we faced during this time. So the young leaders are people who are more engaged, are more brave in a way. So whatever we research, whatever we do in academia is relevant for understanding this process. As another example, collective action back in 2011, there's a new group of politicians who are actually MP members are playing now a significant role in politics. No matter where we agree or disagree with them, there's a new generation. Most of them were the leader of the student movement who were marching and protesting in 2011. They are playing a significant change in politics in Chile. So those processes, those changes in politics are so relevant, and we in academia, in science, we need to understand and study this process very thoroughly. In my view, obviously, the participation of the students within our institutions and participation in actions within universities has been an issue too. And the way we address this issue is so critical. We need to move away from those models that are more kind of radical, not radical, more confronting with political movement inside institutions. We face, last year, we faced a strong action in our university as an example. And the way our president faced this movement was so important for de-escalating the conflict. We need to remove from this more authoritarian way of addressing social change. And we need to learn facing conflict in a way that open the dialogue and open opportunity to growth from this conflict. Conflict not necessarily means negative issues. Conflict are a source of way of changing things. So the way we face conflict, address social movement is so critical. Obviously, we as a professor and learning students, we need to get more closely related into the life of universities, institutions, in order to understand others' point of view. We were just discussing about these tolerance issues, how much we are able to address interaction with people who think so different from my own view without feeling threatened by this idea. And that's part of the main issue now. Collective action could also be related to this negative opposing views about the way we think and we value the world to be. So we need to carefully address way of interacting and particularly addressing collective action in a way that accommodate the needs of the protester. Protesters have the right to protest, and on many democracy, we value protests, but we need to be carefully understanding that the way of protesting could also affect other people's life. So we need to understand carefully in order to implement measures to tackle and allow people to protest, but keep it in a border and fulfilling the goals of this protest, but without influencing or negatively influences other people's life too, because it's also have negative outputs.
Thank you, Roberto. Several other questions are coming in. Thank you. I like your focus on norms in collective action. The last decade has seen mass protests around the world, the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, climate action, Black Lives Matter, etc. Many young people have grown up with social movements as normative. Older people are more inclined to see protests as devious. Do you think that this is different for young people?
Well, definitely. I think young people found a place to express their voice. Collective actions got this benefit for allowing people to join forces to be identified with goals that are relevant for them. Unfortunately, as has been the case in Chile, I guess people working in political science, they know very, very well the turn down of people attending voting, for instance, voting in any given election. It's been a big issue because when we are not able to express voting our ideas, this is critical because we lost trust in the political institutions. People delegitimize the authorities, and we start believing that the only way to face this is in collective action. So collective action should trigger changes also in the political system. That's why the renovation of leaders is so critical. That's why this increasing of the standard of institution delivering power is so critical to recover legitimacy and trust in the institutions. We cannot simply rely on changing behavior, expecting young people to vote if we are not addressing this issue. So for young people, collective action will be now a special place in which they have their voice and they feel they can express. So I can see this as a kind of process. And we need to look at this as not a single event, but it's a process that will take place over the years. And now we need to understand how we can handle this and live with collective action as a way of expressing. Remember, if people don't express, we also create this negative accumulation of thought and emotions that somehow explode. And any given event that we face conflict immediately start to be so radical and influencing so many people's life in many respects. So we need to learn about this. So kids are really motivated to engage in this because they feel empowered. They identify with this group. This group provide them with some fulfill expectation that I guess it will be relevant for them too in the future.
Thank you very much. There's some very interesting questions coming in. We're at the end of our time, but they both, a few of them involve how special you think and unique the situation is in Chile as a result of norms around family and how tight the family linkages are there, maybe compared cross-culturally, and whether the findings that you look at intergenerationally are larger in Chile than you would expect anywhere. I wish I could give you many more minutes to answer that question because, of course, I'm very interested in your answer. But perhaps the audience can look at your work and look in the discussion section for comments of those answers to those sorts of questions. Professor González, it's my great honor to have you here speaking to all of us at ISPP. And thank you again, not only for your work, but for all of your leadership and your dedication to your students, your colleagues, and to all of us at ISPP. And please, everyone, join us next at the business meeting. I'll also be thanking Roberto again, yet again, for all of his service to the organization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. Bye-bye.